Let me shoulder your burden, brother.
Oh, thank you.
Hey!
Hey! What are you doing?
It's not my cross.
Shut up! Get on with it!
He had you there, mate, didn't he?
Dr. Del C. Allison Jr., I have a question from a good friend, Dr. Robert M. Price. He's on the full skeptic side. And I know that he's a polemicist, and his words and his stuff can sometimes get people riled up, if you will, because he's really good with words. But I asked him about the Mary question. Why didn't Paul mention in 1 Corinthians 15 this Mary? Because that stuck out to me, and your explanation is very plausible. Androcentric, they wouldn't have mentioned it. But then I said to myself, and this is just me before I read his question, I said to myself, if the early church is androcentric, one could argue that they're really giving you the historical data here in the Gospels, or we could use the consistency and say, well, they're androcentric too, and maybe they would have left it out as well, just like Paul.
Okay.
And so it's kind of a little potential either way. And I said, is it possible this is narrative? We talk about legend. Maybe even behind all of this, even with what Dr. Price is going to say, maybe there's a kernel there even, because anyway, you get where I'm going. So first, he says from his book, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, first the evangelist knows his readers have never heard the story before, and they will find it suspicious for that reason. Why haven't we heard about this till now? This probably means the story was of fairly recent coinage. Who coined it? No doubt. Notice how he's writing. He's so good. No doubt it was the product of a female mourning cult, such as those who mourned for slain gods like Tammuz, Ezekiel 8:14, Baal-Hadad, Zechariah 12:11, and Osiris. They populated the story with devout women like themselves, based on the searching goddesses, Cybele, Ishtar, Isis, Aphrodite, Anat. It was the ideological legend for their group and its yearly rites. Mark decided to incorporate it into his story, but there were as yet no resurrection stories. He implied that the disciples would be seeing Jesus shortly in Galilee, provided they knew to go there, which they didn't, thanks to the woman. If they somehow managed to get the message some other way, it is certainly strange that no New Testament writer even tries to tell us what transpired between Jesus and Peter on the occasion, nor do there seem to have been any other traditional accounts of resurrection appearances floating around, since when Matthew and Luke added appearance stories onto the end of Mark, it is clear, as we shall see shortly, that they had to make up their own. Anyway.
Okay, so there's a lot there. Let me tackle a little bit of that. So I guess my first response would be, outside of the hypothesis of a female mourning cult producing this story, do we have any evidence otherwise of such a female mourning cult within the early church? Maybe we do, but I'm unaware of the evidence. Now, it is true that there are stories about mourning women looking for the god and that sort of thing. But that in itself simply raises the possibility of fiction, but it doesn't establish it, because we also know, as a matter of historical fact, that real flesh and blood people in mourning go to graves. And there's a lot of Jewish literature on this. In fact, a whole tractate supplement to the Talmud, which is on mourning and is all about what you do at graves and and so on. So the way I look at it is, hypothetically. On the other hand, if women did go up with Jesus to Jerusalem, as the Gospels say, if they did go up to Jerusalem, it would make sense that they would want to know what was going on with Jesus. And if they didn't flee with the disciples for whatever reason, they would probably be at the crucifixion. Crucifixions were public events. That was part of their meaning. Don't do what this poor bastard did, or this is what we're going to do to you. And so they want these places to be at crossroads. Jerusalem's a very small place is 1 square mile in the first century, right? So if Jesus is any sort of celebrity and he's being crucified, it's going to be a big deal. And I assume then that some of his followers, including women, are going to be there. And by the way, if they're pious followers and they really love this guy, they might be interested in what happens to the body when he's dead, right? So they might have. This is all hypothetical, but it's no less hypothetical than the alternative, right? So they might have gone to see where he was, and then after Sabbath, why wouldn't they go back to see him? That's what people do with graves. And by the way, if there's anything behind the story of the empty tomb, that means they know where he was buried. And if they know why he was buried, it's because they must have seen somebody bury him, or have knowledge of it. And I can't imagine that they were at the burial without being at the crucifixion. That doesn't make any sense. So actually, I think being there at the crucifixion makes it very likely that they would have visited the tomb at some time. And if they visited at his tomb at some time, I think it's necessary that they were there for the burial and therefore for the crucifixion. The comment about the women being silent, that is often understood the way he's taking it. I think there are reasons, and spend several pages in the book arguing against this. But one of the things that I think is odd is that if this is an explanation for a decades-long secret, saying "for they were afraid" is a little odd, because what it means is they were afraid for decades, and it doesn't make any sense. I think that Mark would have said something else if this were an explanation for a story that had been kept secret for decades. And then one final point in response to this question. I personally don't think that Matthew and Luke invented their resurrection stories of the 12, because again, if you put Matthew beside Luke's story of the appearance of the 12 and put it beside John's story of the appearance of the 12, they have a common outline. They have a common structure. And if you don't go with simple, this author's dependent upon that one and that one's dependent upon that one, I think the most plausible thing is that these are literary developments of a story that's there in the oral tradition, and it's a story that is referred to in 1 Corinthians 15 as the appearance to the 12. Again, I don't equate the stories in Matthew, Luke, and John with history, but I think they must be descendants from some early story about Jesus commissioning the disciples. And again, if you put them side by side, not only are they structurally the same, but they have several themes in common, and they have several words in common. So that doesn't make sense if Matthew and Luke are independently creating their stories. I think they're dependent upon a common something that's already in place. As for the story of why Peter's appearance is not there, I don't know. I must have cataloged a dozen explanations for that somewhere in the book. But the one that I favor, for no good reason at all, is simply that there was no story to tell. In other words, I think it's quite possible that Jesus appeared to Peter and that he saw Jesus, and that's the end of the story. Nothing was said, he just saw him. Apparitions are often nonverbal. People often just see them and they're there for 3 to 4 or 5 seconds and then they disappear. And it may be we have no story about Peter because there was no story. In other words, Jesus appeared to Peter and there was nothing else to say. Okay? Right. Now, I don't know that. That's just pure speculation. Other people have thought, well, the theology of this appearance as the story was formed didn't suit later theological ideas. I remember one scholar saying that the appearance to Peter was a description of the second coming, and with time that was obviously falsified, and so it fell by the way. You can spin any number of stories, but the most natural one for me is that, heck, Jesus appeared to him and nothing happened. He was, oh, there he is, and that he's gone.
And that was sufficient.
And that's well, it's not sufficient for anything. You still have to interpret. And one of the things I really emphasize in the book is that I think that the disciples, the first disciples, Peter, Mary, and the rest of them, they are, whatever else they are, followers of Jesus. And so they've been listening to this guy for a year or 2 years or 3 years, and they're his followers, which means he is the teacher. So his theology is their theology. And if he is, like Albert Schweitzer and Johannes Weiss thought, an apocalyptic prophet, then they're going to interpret whatever happens within an end-time scenario, which is what I think happened. That is, you could see somebody and have an empty tomb and say, that's puzzling, right. But they don't do that. They try to plug in what happened to the scenario they had before Easter. And the scenario before Easter is the general resurrection of the dead, the near end, the Great Tribulation, and all that sort of thing.
Huh. There's so much here. It's really fun. In your book, you do a really interesting talk about different endings of Mark, like what people speculate. You talk about like, did it rot? Did they cut it out because they didn't like that it didn't appear to Peter? I mean, the church is all about Peter. You know, there's so many cool things you say.
Well, actually, one of the things I remark on, and you know, your experiences always influence you too much. But I really did once, so this was before everything was done electronically. This goes back probably 20 years or so, where you still send off a manuscript in addition to the electronic copy. And I sent a manuscript in, and I don't know, I can't remember which publisher it was, but a couple of weeks later or 3 weeks later, I got an email and it said, could you send us the last page? We've misplaced it. Now, of course, if you're going to lose a page, it's going to be the first page or the last page. That's just going to be the case. And if you look at a lot of old texts, Dead Sea Scrolls, you know, it's often the first few columns or the last few columns that are in the worst shape. That just makes sense. So the fact that this happened to me and we lost the last page of my manuscript makes me think, you know, this is possible, right? And the truth is that I don't know that Mark ended at 16:8. Now, a lot of people just seem to know this these days, but it wasn't a dominant opinion before the 1960s. And I think there's a sort of modern tendency to like Mark ending at 16:8 because it makes it more modern. It's unresolved. It leaves you with question marks, and it's very mysterious. And Frank Kermode, a famous literary critic, was one of the individuals who pushed the idea that Mark is complete with verse 8. And it may be, I don't know that it's not, but I do think the part of the spirit of modern literature, right, which is all existential anguish and confusion and buzzing mess we're in, it likes Mark ending at 16:8, or a lot of people actually like that, and they don't like the sort of nice, neat conclusion that you find in Matthew, where everything's wrapped up, and that's not very modern. I mean, that's pre-modern. You got everything figured out, and we don't have things figured out. So I think there's a bias against that, and it was obvious if you read after Westcott and Hort and the decisions about getting rid of the received text, it was obvious to people for about 80 years that Mark must have had an ending that's been gone. And now it's obvious to lots of people that, no, it must have ended there. To me, nothing is obvious, and I don't know how Mark originally ended. I'm just an agnostic about it.
It's a good question to ask, though, follow up as we conclude this recording. When... because you're the magnifying glass, and I always use you as the guy who really is paying close attention, when do you think that the ending of Mark went missing, if there was one? And I say that to say, we know Matthew's using Mark. I mean, 90% of Mark is in Matthew. We know over 50% of Mark is in Luke. And we think about this narrative, like, do you think Matthew and Luke had an ending to Mark? If you thought there was one, do you think?
I don't think Luke, I don't think... So the way to put this is, I doubt that Luke did, but it's possible that Matthew does. So there are people who think that Matthew 28:16 through 20 is a rewriting of whatever Mark had at his conclusion, because it is an appearance of Jesus in Galilee. Now, I don't know this, but it's not implausible. So Matthew's ending is very redactional. It's a really nice summary of what's going on. So if Matthew had a source, as I think he did, apart from whether he knows the ending of Mark, if he has a source, he really has rewritten it and he's made it his own. He's even got a Trinitarian formula, right? That can't be early.
Matthew did?
Matthew did. He baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, right?
Oh, is that?
That's in Matthew.
Do you think that was original to Matthew?
I think it's probably original to Matthew, but I don't think it predates Matthew. I think Matthew was introducing this at the end of the first century. Okay?
Yeah, I'm wondering. This is so
oh, you
interesting.
think that's a
No,
interpolation?
I don't. I'm just saying that and dating Matthew.
So there are people who think that clause, or a few scholars have thought that clause must be a later addition to Matthew. I don't think they've made their case, but there is a case to be made. It is a little, it's unusual, right?
Yeah. That's why I'm saying
it's one of the first appearances of that phrase.
Why it's unusual to me is just how early. Like, I get Trinity, especially over time. I didn't think it'd be that early.
Well, there are Trinitarian-like formulations in Paul where he talks about God and the Son and the Spirit, and they're in close connection. Even the baptismal story in Mark, God speaks, the Spirit descends, and there's the Son.
Right.
So later Trinitarians found something there. The point is that these things are together in the tradition, but Matthew may well be the first to make this sort of plain, clear statement like that. And by the way, I don't know what the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit is. And when people read it, they don't think, because people who are reading it are churchgoers. And, it's language. It makes them feel good. But in a Jewish context, if Matthew is a Jewish text, the name, and it's one name, it's ta-onoma in the Greek, it's one name, it's possible that Matthew is thinking, the tetragrammaton, the Yahweh, right? That is the name, right? If, I don't know that that's the case, but if it is the case, then of course when it goes into the Gentile world, that's just all forgotten. And then people say the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and you ask, what do you mean? And well, I don't know, it's just something we say, right?
Wow. Thank you.
Look, it's not my cross.
What?
It's not my cross. I was holding it for someone.
Just lie down. I haven't got all day.
No, of course. Look, I hate to make a fuss.
Look, we've had a busy day. There's 140 of you lot to get up.
Is he Jewish?
Will you be quiet?
We don't want any more Samaritans around here.
Belt up!
Will you let me down if he comes back?
Yeah, we'll let you down.